Hi everyone, I'm Jamie, and welcome back to this next week of being community and discussing more of Bob Goff's adventures in life and in loving people extravagantly in this book, Everybody Always. So this week we're covering chapters 14 through 18, which contain some of my favorite stories in the whole entire book. And there's one chapter that has the most underlines in the entire book. So before we get there, we're going to start with Jesus. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 15 that out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. Out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. And that verse kept coming to mind as I read Bob Goff's story about carrying that big bucket around with him. So in case you missed it, in chapter 17 in Everybody Always, Bob decides to carry around a big bucket with him to remind him what he's filling the bucket of his heart and his mind with. So he takes it everywhere with him. A particularly powerful story is about how his impatience in the car rental return line at the airport almost completely undid the ministry that he had done at church that morning because the employee in the line at the car rental had been at church that morning and listened to him speak. And if he had let his impatience about missing his flight out on that person, as everyone else in front of him in line was, it would have completely undone the ministry that he had done that morning in church. And so the bucket next to him in his car was a tangible reminder to stay patient, even when he was missing his flight and watching the moments tick off on the clock. So he writes on page 161, and he says, here's the simple message that God has for us. If we fill our buckets with love, we can actually become love. So as we look at the chapters 14 through 18 this week, I have a simple question to ask you today. If we're taking the perspective of Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 15, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. Based on that, of what's kind of like sloshing out of that bucket, if you use that imagery, based on what's slopping out of your bucket these days, what is in your bucket? Is it love? Is joy sloshing out? Is it peace that passes understanding? Peace that doesn't make any sense given your circumstances? Or is it more on the side of anger is what's sloshing out? Frustration, apathy? What God has for you, for me, for all of us is an abundance of love. God has so much love for you and for all of us that it sloshes out of this God-sized bucket all over humans. And the fruit of spending time with God is that we can't help but to get sloshed so much with God's love that it generates more love coming out of us to the people around us. And that's a great launching point then into the other chapters that we are covering today. In chapter 15, the story about the welcome from Walter. It's a beautiful story of how well Walter reminds everyone of how important they are, and that reminds me of a story that has shaped my life ever since it happened when I was 18 years old. I was on a mission trip with my youth group, and our youth groups got split up and mixed with other kids from around the country so that we could build relationships outside our youth group and serve together. There was a gal in my group from another youth group, and her name was Hillary. And I didn't talk with her very much throughout the whole week because we were painting a house and we were usually on opposite sides of the house painting throughout the day. So whenever I would see her, when we were like refilling our paint buckets or something, I would just smile. I would ask her how she was doing, which for me was pretty normal interaction. And at the end of the week, on the last night of the trip, she pulled me and a couple other gals from our youth group aside, and she was crying, and I could tell she'd been crying for a long time as well. And she let us know that before coming on the trip, she had tried a couple of times to end her life, but she had never quite gone through with it. And she said that when she had left for this trip, she had a plan that she was going to enact when she got home to end her life. But because of the different ways that God spoke to her throughout this trip, because of the way that she had felt God's love in her life, particularly, and this shocked me, through the smiles that we would give her, the eye contact, the just general checking in and gentle presence with her, she said, I realized because of that, because you smiled at me, because of the way you treated me, I realized that my life is worth something. It's worth keeping, and I'm not going to enact my plan when I get home. I was floored I never expected the power of God's love moving through me just simply in the form of smiles and saying hello could have that sort of impact. So for us, never underestimate the power of how we treat one another in just the simple passing sort of ways. When we have God's joy sloshing over on us and sloshing over on other people, they can more easily sense God's joy for them. So Walter in the book is a great picture of that. His presence makes people feel safe, welcome, and Walter models to people about how God feels about them. So if you'll go with me to page 142, I underlined what Bob wrote about what Walter says, kind of the middle of the page, the end of the first paragraph. Bob writes, Walter treats them as if they were Jesus himself, because Walter knows Jesus, and Jesus said the way that Walter treats these people is the way that he's treating them. So if we immerse ourselves in the bucket of God's love, that's what's going to slosh out of us onto other people. And the best thing about God's love is that God's love is not choosy in who it pours out on. It sloshes out on everyone, always. And that's what God calls us to do as well. So that takes me back to chapter 14, which is the chapter that's my absolute favorite in the entire book. This is the chapter where Bob and his son try landing the seaplane. They have this little airplane, it lands on water, and one day they're out flying around, and it's this spur of the moment type of thing. Bob's flying with his son. They're both pilots. They both have their pilot's license. And Bob says, hey, let's see if we can land this plane on that little lake. Sounds like it's surrounded by cliffs. And his son is like, Dad, you're crazy. And if you know Bob Goff, you know that he is crazy in his love. And so he's like, yeah, we're just going to do this. And so they are just like holding their breath. Everyone is feeling a little bit tense, not quite sure what's going to happen. And they land the plane in this little lake surrounded by cliffs. And they look at each other and like let out a, woo, we did it. And then Bob looks at his son and he hands the keys to the plane to his son. And he's like, okay, you're going to fly it out of here. His son thinks Bob is a little bonkers for suggesting it, but his son successfully gets the plane out past the cliffs, and then Bob has him turn the plane back around and land it himself on the little lake. It's this wild story full of adrenaline. And the best part is where Bob uses the story of this plane to illustrate how just like he knew his son could maneuver the plane around, God trusts us to get engaged with life with God and just fly the plane, just land the plane. We can overthink and overplan and get lost in the process. Bob says on page 136, if you'll go there, 136, right at the top of the first paragraph there, the people who have shaped my faith the most did the same for me. They didn't try to teach me anything. They let me know that they trusted me, and that taught me everything. Those moments are forever etched into who I am. I think God does the same with us. And that hit home for me. So many times in my life, I get analysis paralysis. I overthink and then procrastinate on making a decision because I just want to make the right decision or because I'm waiting for God to reveal what the thing is for me to do. And I just want to sit tight until I get the spiritual green light. But that's not how God handles doing life with us. Later down on that same page, Bob hits us with this, if I can go back. He says, what a shame it would be if we were waiting for God to say something. Well, God's been waiting on us to do something. He speaks to me the loudest on the way. Simply put, if we want more faith, we need to do more stuff. I don't know about you, but that's very true in my life. Faith follows action. It would be so nice if I had the faith to do something first, and then I could do that thing because I have the faith, and then I can look back and say, wow, wasn't that nice? But I find that my faith grows in the doing. With so many people that I've worked with over the years, I've seen that same principle to be true. Objects at rest stay at rest, especially when it comes to faith. Objects in motion or people in motion in faith and love tend to stay in motion. And so I ask you these questions as we wrap up today. I wonder what God is speaking to you about your life in these chapters. What might God be challenging you to do? Do you feel like maybe God is calling you to land a plane somewhere? That God believes in you. God is like, I just want to do this adventure with you. You don't have to do it the right way. Let's just land the plane. Or to consider what's filling your bucket. What is it that's sloshing out of you onto other people? And how does all of that help us to be more loving towards one another, to show up for one another the way that Jesus shows up for us? So everyone, we have one more week after this and this study. Thank you so much for being here this week, and we will see you next week to finish strong.